My wife was a marriage therapist, but this didn't distract her from destroying ours. The garage doors mechanical were felt different that evening, heavier somehow, like the weight of unspoken words. I sat in my car for an extra moment, studying the familiar outlines of our shared life through the windshield, Emma's gardening tools arranged with meticulous precision, the vintage bicycle we'd restored together during that first summer of marriage, the carefully labeled storage bins that spoke of her organizing genius. After 11 years of marriage, I thought I knew every nuance of Emma's expressions, every subtle shift in her mood. But lately, something had changed, something I couldn't quite name. It wasn't in what she said, but in the spaces between her words, in the way her smile seemed to fade a fraction of a second too quickly, in how her eyes would drift to her phone during our conversations. I found her in the kitchen, chopping vegetables with the precision of someone lost in thought. The kitchen island between us felt like a continent. "Hey, Nathan," she said, not looking up from the cutting board. The knife's rhythmic tapping against the wooden surface filled the silence. "How was your day?" "The usual. That project for the Anderson account is finally wrapping up." I loosened my tie, watching her hands move with practiced efficiency. "You?" "Fine. Busy." The word hung in the air like mist. "The therapy practice is getting more clients. Dr. Rivera thinks we might need to bring in another counselor." There was a time when that news would have sparked an excited conversation about her growing practice, about her dreams of expanding the therapy center she'd built from scratch. Instead, she continued chopping, each slice precise and controlled. I opened the fridge, more from habit than hunger, studying the family photos held by magnets, us hiking in Colorado, Emma's graduation from her psychology program, the day we bought this house. Happy moments frozen in time, yet somehow they felt like artifacts from another life. "I was thinking," she said suddenly, setting down the knife. "Maybe we should invite the Petersons over for dinner this weekend. It's been a while." The suggestion caught me off guard. Lisa and Mark Peterson had been our closest friends until about 6 months ago, when Emma had suddenly become distant with them. She'd blamed it on being too busy, but it had never felt like the whole truth. "Sure," I said carefully. "I'll text Mark." She nodded, resuming her chopping. The knife's rhythm had changed, slightly faster, slightly harder against the board. I watched her for a moment longer, trying to decode the subtle tension in her shoulders, the way she seemed both present and somewhere else entirely. Later that night, as we moved through our evening routine like actors in a familiar play, I caught her staring at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, her expression unguarded for once. The look in her eyes made my chest tighten. It was the same look she got when preparing to deliver difficult news to her patients. I wanted to ask what was wrong, to bridge whatever invisible gap had formed between us. Instead, I pretended not to notice, focusing on brushing my teeth as the question echoed in my mind: when had we started performing normalcy instead of living it? That night, lying beside her in our carefully chosen medium-firm mattress, listening to her measured breathing that told me she was only pretending to sleep, I realized something that sent a chill down my spine. I couldn't remember the last time she truly laughed, not the polite chuckle she used in social situations, but the genuine, unguarded laugh that used to make her eyes crinkle at the corners. As I drifted off to sleep, a quote from one of Emma's psychology books floated through my mind. "The most significant changes in relationships often begin not with words, but with silence." In the darkness, those words felt less like wisdom and more like a warning. The dinner with the Petersons never happened. Emma called Lisa herself to cancel, citing a last-minute client emergency. I watched her make the call from across our living room, noting how she turned slightly away, her free hand fidgeting with the throw pillow's zipper, a tell she'd developed in graduate school when constructing careful half-truths during role-play therapy sessions. That weekend, instead of hosting our friends, we found ourselves in what Emma called a relationship maintenance conversation. She'd been suggesting these talks more frequently lately, using her therapist's voice, the one that made every word feel like it had been carefully selected from a clinical manual. "I've been thinking about us," she said, sitting cross-legged on our sectional sofa, a cup of her favorite chamomile tea cooling untouched beside her. About how relationships evolve, how people grow and change. I felt my shoulders tense. In our early years, these conversations had been different, organic, sometimes messy, but always real. Now they felt like carefully orchestrated performances. Nathan, do you ever wonder if we're too comfortable? She watched me with that new, analytical gaze that made me feel less like her husband and more like one of her cases. If maybe we've lost something by becoming so predictable? The question hung between us like smoke. I thought about our routine: Sunday brunches at Le Petit Café, movie nights where we gradually shifted from sharing a blanket to sitting at opposite ends of the couch, the way we'd stopped finishing each other's sentences. I thought comfortable was good, I said carefully, watching her reaction. Stable. Secure. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Secure doesn't have to mean stagnant. She paused, twisting her wedding ring, a new habit I'd noticed in the past few months. I've been seeing it a lot in my practice lately. Couples who mistake comfort for completion, who stop challenging each other to grow. Something in her tone made me think she wasn't really talking about her clients. What kind of growth did you have in mind? I asked, trying to ignore the knot forming in my stomach. I don't know yet, she admitted, finally picking up her tea, then setting it down again without drinking. But I think we need to be open to possibilities. Changes. Different ways of being together. Later that night, I found myself in our home office, staring at an old photo from our wedding day. Emma was laughing at something I'd whispered in her ear, her joy uncontained and real. I tried to remember what I'd said, but the memory felt just out of reach, like so much else lately. My eyes drifted to her desk, where her laptop sat closed. She'd changed the password recently, something she'd never done before. When I'd asked about it, she'd mentioned client confidentiality, which made sense given her practice. But like so many things lately, the timing felt off. As I turned off the office light, I caught sight of a new self-help book on her shelf. Redefining Boundaries in Modern Marriage. The bookmark was nearly halfway through. I wondered when she'd started reading it, and why she hadn't mentioned it during our conversation about growth and change. That night, I dreamed of our first apartment, of Emma dancing in the kitchen to old vinyl records, of a time when our silences were comfortable instead of loaded with unspoken words. I woke to find her side of the bed empty, the faint glow of her phone screen visible from the master bathroom, where she sat scrolling through something she quickly closed when I appeared in the doorway. Couldn't sleep, she explained, her smile not quite masking the guilt in her eyes. Just catching up on some work emails. At 3 a.m., I thought, but didn't say. The changes in Emma became more pronounced in ways that seemed insignificant individually but formed a disturbing pattern when viewed together. Like the way she'd started going to a new yoga studio across town instead of the one 3 blocks from our house. Better instructors, she'd said, but her yoga mat stayed suspiciously clean for someone attending 4 classes a week. I found myself noting these details in my phone's notes app, like collecting pieces of a puzzle I wasn't sure I wanted to complete. The growing list made me feel simultaneously vigilant and ashamed. Wasn't trust the foundation of our marriage? But trust, I was learning, could be eroded by 1,000 tiny doubts. The breaking point came during what should have been an ordinary moment. I was helping Emma clear out her closet, her idea, part of what she called her personal reinvention journey, when a shopping bag fell from the top shelf. Out spilled the receipt for a dress I'd never seen, along with a small notebook I didn't recognize. Emma snatched it up before I could get a proper look, her movements too quick, too defensive. Just session notes, she said, tucking it into her back pocket. But I'd caught a glimpse of the handwriting, too irregular for her usual precise documentation, more like stream of consciousness journaling. That night, I lay awake remembering the look in her eyes when she grabbed the notebook, not guilt exactly, but something adjacent to fear. The Emma I'd married had been an open book, literally keeping her journals on our shared bookshelf, often reading passages aloud as we discussed our days. When had she started keeping secrets? You're distant lately, she said the next morning over coffee, her tone carrying an edge of accusation that made me nearly laugh at the irony. Is something wrong? I studied her across our kitchen island, this woman who wore my wife's face but somehow felt like a stranger. She'd started wearing her hair differently, subtle highlights I hadn't noticed her getting. Even her morning routine had shifted. She now took her coffee black instead of with the hazelnut creamer she'd sworn by for a decade. Just tired, I said, the lie tasting bitter. Work stuff. She nodded, accepting the excuse too easily, and I wondered if she was relieved not to have to dig deeper. The old Emma would have pressed, would have seen through my deflection. This new Emma seemed content with our surface-level exchanges, as if maintaining distance was preferable to risking real connection. Later that day, I found myself parked outside her therapy practice during what should have been her yoga class. The guilt of checking up on her churned in my stomach, but not as much as the sight of her car absent from the parking lot. I sat there for 20 minutes, watching the spring rain trace patterns on my windshield, feeling like I'd crossed some invisible line in our marriage. On the drive home, I remembered something Emma had said during one of her therapy conferences years ago. The most dangerous lies in a marriage are the ones we tell ourselves. At the time, it had seemed like an interesting theoretical concept. Now it felt like a warning I should have heeded sooner. That evening, Emma suggested we try a new restaurant downtown, an intimate French place she'd heard about from a colleague. As she described the restaurant's ambience, I noticed she was wearing a subtle new perfume, something with notes of jasmine that reminded me of early spring. I wondered when she'd bought it, and why she hadn't worn it around me until now. It'll be good for us, she said, reaching across the kitchen island to touch my hand, a gesture that once would have felt natural but now seemed calculated. To break out of our routine. I agreed, watching her smile in response, and felt the weight of unasked questions settling in my chest like stones. The French restaurant, Le Jardin Secret, lived up to its name. Hidden behind an unmarked door in a renovated brownstone, it felt like stepping into another world, one where secrets were currency and shadows held conversations of their own. Emma moved through the space with familiar ease, following the maitre d' to a corner table as if she'd walked this path before. Something about her confidence here made my skin prickle. She'd mentioned hearing about this place from a colleague, but she navigated it like someone who'd memorized its geography. The way she angled her chair slightly toward the bar, her instinctive reach for the wine list, small gestures that spoke of routine rather than discovery. They have an amazing wine selection, she said, scanning the menu with practiced eyes. The sommelier here really knows how to pair with their seasonal menu. I watched her hands as she spoke, noticed how she'd stopped wearing her grandmother's sapphire ring, the one she'd worn on her right hand since before our wedding. When had that changed? The question joined the growing collection of uncertainties in my mind. You seem to know a lot about this place, I said carefully, studying her reaction over the rim of my water glass. A flicker of something, tension perhaps, crossed her face before dissolving into a practiced smile. Oh, Charlotte from the practice raves about it. She's quite the foodie. The name was new to me, another colleague I'd never met from her expanding circle of professional acquaintances. The sommelier appeared, Thomas, Emma called him, though he hadn't introduced himself, and she ordered a bottle of Bordeaux with the kind of specific knowledge that comes from experience rather than recommendation. He smiled at her with friendly recognition that seemed to stretch beyond the usual server-patron relationship. Have you been here before? I asked after he left, trying to keep my voice neutral. Just for lunch, she said quickly. Too quickly. With the team from work. Did I not mention it? The lie settled between us like frost, delicate but unmistakable. I remembered checking her office parking lot during supposed lunch hours, finding her car consistently absent. The weight of unspoken questions made the intimate space feel suffocating. Emma launched into a discussion about her latest therapy techniques, her voice taking on that professional cadence she used when deflecting. But I found myself fixating on a detail that seemed suddenly significant. She'd worn the deep blue dress she'd bought last month, the one from the receipt I'd found, the one she'd said was for client consultations. It fit her perfectly, suggesting alterations, suggesting planning. Nathan? Her voice cut through my thoughts. You seem somewhere else tonight. I met her eyes across the table, searching for traces of the woman who used to share Sunday crossword puzzles with me, who'd cry at dog food commercials, who'd wake me at midnight to watch meteor showers. Instead, I found myself looking at someone who'd mastered the art of being present while remaining completely unreachable. Just thinking about something you said earlier, I replied. About breaking routines. She smiled, a practiced expression that didn't quite reach her eyes. Change can be good for us. Sometimes we need to see things from a new perspective. As she spoke, her phone buzzed on the table. She turned it face down with practiced casualness, but not before I caught sight of a message preview. Can't wait for. The rest remained hidden, another piece of the puzzle I wasn't sure I was ready to complete. The evening continued like a play where we both knew our lines but had forgotten the meaning behind them. Emma ordered with confidence, shared stories about her practice, laughed at appropriate moments. But there was a performative quality to it all, as if we were actors in a scene about a married couple rather than actually being one. Walking to the car afterward, she took my hand, a gesture that should have felt natural but instead highlighted the growing distance between us. Her fingers were cool against mine, and I noticed she'd removed her wedding ring for dinner, claiming it was too tight with the humid weather. That night, lying in bed, I realized something that sent a chill through my core. I couldn't remember the last time silence between us had felt like connection rather than concealment. Memory is a strange thing. Sometimes it takes a moment of crisis to illuminate the past, like lightning revealing the true shape of storm clouds. After the dinner at Le Jardin Secret, I found myself obsessively revisiting moments from the past year, each memory taking on new meaning under the harsh light of suspicion. I remembered last Christmas, when Emma had insisted on spending the holiday apart for the first time in our marriage. My patients need extra support during the holidays, she'd explained, scheduling emergency sessions on Christmas Eve. I'd spent the evening alone, watching old home videos, noting how her laugh had changed over the years, from unrestrained joy to something more measured, more controlled. The revelation came unexpectedly, as they often do. I was searching our home office for a misplaced tax document when I found an old photo album wedged behind her psychology textbooks. Inside, between pages of our early years together, was a folded letter dated 6 months ago. It wasn't addressed to me. My dearest E. Our conversation today about paths not taken. I closed the letter before finishing, my hands trembling. The paper felt like it was burning my fingers. I returned it exactly as I'd found it, but the words I'd glimpsed kept echoing in my mind, transforming familiar memories into question marks. That evening, Emma came home later than usual, her cheeks flushed from what she said was a therapeutic breakthrough with a client. She moved through our kitchen with nervous energy, talking too fast about a new counseling technique she was developing. It's about helping people recognize their authentic selves, she explained, chopping vegetables with the same precision she now applied to everything in her life. Sometimes we build these elaborate cages of obligation and habit, convincing ourselves they're homes. I watched her hands move, remembering how they used to reach for mine across the dinner table, how they gesture wildly when she was excited about something. Now every movement seemed choreographed, deliberate. Do you ever think about who you were before? I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it. Before us? She paused, knife hovering over a half-cut carrot. For a moment, I caught a glimpse of something raw and real in her expression before her therapist's mask slid back into place. The past shapes us, she said carefully, resuming her chopping. But we can't let it define us. People evolve, Nathan. Sometimes in different directions. That night, I lay awake listening to her breathe, remembering the Emma who used to wake me up to dance in the kitchen at midnight, who'd leave post-it notes with silly drawings in my briefcase, who'd cry during animal rescue commercials. When had that woman begun to fade? Or had I been too comfortable in our routine to notice the metamorphosis happening right beside me? I thought about the letter hidden in the photo album, about paths not taken and cages we build. About how sometimes the greatest distance isn't measured in miles but in the space between who we were and who we've become. My phone buzzed softly, a text from Mark Peterson. Hey man, been thinking about you. Got time for coffee this week? There's something you should know. I stared at the message for a long time, feeling like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing the next step would change everything. Beside me, Emma shifted in her sleep, murmuring something I couldn't quite catch, or perhaps chose not to hear. The coffee shop Mark chose was deliberately far from our usual haunts, a small place tucked between a bookstore and a vintage record shop. I found him already seated in a corner booth, fingers drumming anxiously against a paper cup. The nervous energy radiating from him made my stomach twist. I've been trying to figure out how to have this conversation, he said after we exchanged awkward greetings. His eyes wouldn't quite meet mine, focusing instead on the steam rising from his untouched coffee. Lisa thinks I should stay out of it, but you're my friend, Nathan. The fluorescent lights seemed too harsh suddenly, casting sharp shadows across Mark's face as he struggled with words that clearly wanted to stay unspoken. I thought about Emma's abrupt distance from the Petersons, how she'd orchestrated our gradual drift from these once close friends. I saw Emma last week, he continued, his voice dropping. Not at her practice. She was at Riverside Park, near the old boathouse. He paused, weighing each word. She was with someone. They seemed intimate. The word intimate echoed in my head like a bell tone in an empty church. I remembered how Emma used to describe intimacy to her patients, not just physical closeness, but the sharing of hidden selves. How many hidden selves had she developed while I wasn't looking? It might not be what it looked like, Mark added quickly, but his tone betrayed his disbelief in his own words. But the way they were talking, their body language. I would have said something sooner, but Lisa made me promise to stay out of it. Said sometimes people need to figure things out on their own. I thought about the letter in the photo album, about Emma's new perfume, about all the small changes that had accumulated like sediment in a once clear stream. How long have you known? About the park? Just last week. But, he hesitated, turning his cup slowly. There have been other things. Lisa noticed first, at that charity gala 6 months ago. The way Emma was talking about marriage, about how people outgrow each other. It felt rehearsed. Like she was trying to convince herself of something. 6 months ago. The timeline clicked into place. When she started the yoga classes, when she changed her phone password, when she'd begun speaking about growth and change with clinical detachment. There's something else, Mark said, reaching for his phone. Lisa will kill me for showing you this, but... He pulled up a text conversation, sliding the phone across the table. It was a group chat from 3 months ago, planning a girls' night out. Emma's name wasn't in it, but Lisa had mentioned running into her at a wine bar downtown, on a night Emma had told me she was working late at the practice. I'm sorry, Mark said softly. I didn't know what to do with this information. Emma's been acting so different lately, and Lisa said maybe it was just work stress, but... I stared at my reflection in the coffee shop window, seeing myself as if from a distance, a man realizing that the story of his marriage might have been fiction all along. Outside, fall leaves skittered across the sidewalk, carried by a wind that seemed to whisper of change and loss. Thank you, I said finally, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. For telling me. As I drove home, I remembered something Emma had said in her therapy blog years ago. Trust isn't broken in grand moments of betrayal, but in the small choices we make when we think no one is watching. I wondered how many small choices had led us here, to this moment of unraveling. My phone buzzed, a text from Emma. Working late tonight. Don't wait up. I pulled into our driveway, staring at the dark windows of our home, and felt the weight of all the questions I wasn't ready to ask settling around me like gathering storm clouds. That night, instead of going home, I drove to our old neighborhood, past the first apartment we'd rented together, where the rent was too high and the heating never worked quite right. Emma and I used to joke that it forced us to cuddle more, turning winter's chill into an excuse for closeness. I parked outside Pete's diner, where we used to share midnight pancakes after her late study sessions. Through the window, I could see our old booth, now occupied by a young couple leaning close, sharing secrets and syrup-sweet kisses. The sight made something in my chest ache with a peculiar mixture of nostalgia and loss. My phone buzzed again. Client emergency. Might be very late. Emma's text was perfectly professional, carefully worded. I thought about Mark's revelation, about the boathouse, about all the client emergencies that had populated our calendar lately. The rational part of my brain, the part that had made me successful in corporate finance, wanted to start gathering evidence, to build a case file of inconsistencies and lies. But another part of me, the part that still remembered the taste of Emma's homemade chocolate chip cookies on Sunday mornings, wanted to believe there was a logical explanation for everything. I found myself opening our shared calendar app, scrolling back through months of Emma's carefully documented appointments. Patterns emerged like constellations: yoga, classes that never appeared on the studio's schedule, client consultations that didn't align with her practice's hours, professional development, sessions that left no paper trail. My phone rang, startling me. Lisa Peterson's name flashed on the screen. Nathan? Her voice carried an edge of concern. Mark told me about your conversation. I think there are things you should know about what's been happening with Emma. I'm not sure I want to know, I admitted, surprising myself with the honesty. It's not what you might be thinking, Lisa said carefully. But Emma's been different. The things she's been saying in our women's group, her new perspectives on marriage and commitment. It's like she's trying to justify something to herself. I remembered the self-help book on her shelf. Redefining Boundaries in Modern Marriage. What boundaries was she really trying to redefine? Last month, Lisa continued, her voice dropping, she gave this whole speech about how traditional marriage models are outdated, how people need to be free to explore their authentic selves. It felt like she was reading from a script, Nathan. Like she was rehearsing for something. The words hit me like ice water. I thought about Emma's recent suggestions about breaking routines and exploring new perspectives. About her increasing references to clients who had outgrown their relationships. Has she mentioned? I started, then stopped, not sure what I was really asking. She's been spending a lot of time with her new therapy group, Lisa said, filling the silence. Some progressive relationship counseling circle. She talks about it like it's revolutionary, but Nathan, some of the ideas they promote. She trailed off, leaving the implication hanging. After hanging up, I sat in my car watching couples enter and exit Pete's diner, each one carrying their own story, their own secrets. I thought about Emma's growing obsession with authenticity and self-discovery, wondering if our entire marriage had become a case study in her evolutionary theories about relationships. When I finally drove home, the house was dark except for a faint light in her home office. Through the window, I could see Emma at her desk, typing intently. She'd changed clothes since morning, wearing an outfit I'd never seen before, her hair styled differently than when she'd left for work. I sat in the driveway, watching my wife's silhouette and thinking about the strange alchemy that could transform a lifetime of trust into a shadow play of doubts. Tomorrow, I knew, she would have a perfectly reasonable explanation for everything. The question was, would I still be able to believe it? The following morning, I woke to find Emma already gone, a note on her pillow written in her new, more angular handwriting. Early session with the therapy group. Let's have dinner tonight. The question mark felt deliberately placed, as if even this simple suggestion required my careful consideration. I called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years, my mind too clouded with questions to focus on spreadsheets and profit margins. Instead, I found myself drawn to Emma's home office, a space that had once been as familiar to me as my own reflection but now felt like entering foreign territory. The room still held traces of the Emma I'd married, framed photos of us hiking in Colorado, her collection of psychology books arranged by color, a habit I'd always teased her about, the small ceramic owl I'd bought her when she opened her practice. But new elements had crept in, transforming the space like ivy slowly claiming a wall. Her laptop was closed but not locked, unusual for her lately. A sticky note on the desk caught my eye. Authentic Self Workshop 7 p.m. Thursday. Below it, another note. discuss boundaries/evolution with group. I sat in her chair, absorbing the subtle changes in the room. New books had appeared on her shelves. The Myth of Monogamy, Radical Honesty in Modern Relationships, Breaking Free from Conventional Love. Each title felt like a small betrayal, a quiet rejection of everything we built together. A journal lay open on her desk, her handwriting flowing across the pages in emotional waves. I started to close it, respecting the privacy she'd become so protective of lately, when a passage caught my eye. Sometimes I wonder if we mistake comfort for contentment, stability for stagnation. N represents everything I thought I wanted: safety, security, unwavering devotion. But lately, I find myself questioning, is devotion just another word for limitation? Are we limiting ourselves by refusing to acknowledge that people can love differently, grow differently? The words burned like acid in my chest. I thought about all the times she talked about her clients' struggles with conventional relationship paradigms, wondering now if she'd really been talking about herself. A photo slipped from between the journal's pages, Emma with a group of people I'd never met, all wearing expression of intense engagement. They sat in a circle, some holding hands, others gesturing expressively. Emma's face glowed with an animation I hadn't seen in months, her body language open in a way it no longer was at home. The door chime startled me. Through the front window, I saw Lisa Peterson standing on our porch, clutching what looked like a folder to her chest. Her expression carried the weight of someone about to share difficult truths. I let her in, noticing how she glanced around our living room as if seeing it for the first time, or perhaps the last time. She settled on our couch, where Emma and I had spent countless Sunday afternoons reading together. "I've been struggling with whether to show you this," she said, opening the folder. "Emma's been attending these workshops. They're not just about therapy techniques." She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "They're about redefining relationship boundaries, about challenging traditional commitment structures. But Nathan, I think there's more to it than just theoretical exploration." As Lisa spoke, laying out a timeline of subtle changes she'd observed in Emma, I found myself remembering something my wife had said years ago, when we were first dating. "The scariest part of loving someone is that you have to be willing to let them evolve, even if they evolve away from you." At the time, it had seemed like a beautiful, profound observation about love's selfless nature. Now those words took on a different shape, casting shadows I wasn't sure I was ready to face. Lisa's folder contained printouts of workshop materials, their pages dense with highlighted passages about conscious uncoupling and ethical non-monogamy. But what caught my attention was a photograph paperclip to one of the handouts, Emma standing at a podium, addressing a room full of people with an intensity one barely recognized. "She's become one of their featured speakers," Lisa said softly, her fingers nervously smoothing the folder's edge. "The group calls themselves Evolution of Love. They believe traditional marriage is limiting." The sound of my own heartbeat seemed too loud in our sun-drenched living room. Through the window, I could see our neighbors' children playing in their yard, their laughter a stark counterpoint to the weight settling in my chest. "There's something else," Lisa continued, pulling out a printed email thread. "Emma's been documenting her journey. She's writing a book, Nathan. About marriage evolution, about outgrowing traditional bonds." She hesitated, then added, "She's using your relationship as a case study." The words hit me like physical blows. Our life together, every intimate moment, every shared dream, every private struggle, reduced to clinical analysis, theoretical frameworks, and carefully constructed narratives about the limitations of conventional love. I remembered finding Emma's journal entry about me representing stability, about devotion being another word for limitation. Now I understood, I wasn't just her husband anymore. I had become her research subject, an unwitting participant in her grand thesis about the evolution of modern relationships. "She's scheduled to give a keynote speech next month," Lisa said, her voice gentle as if delivering a terminal diagnosis. "The topic is breaking free, when growth means goodbye." The irony wasn't lost on me. Emma, who had once written her graduate thesis on the importance of trust in therapeutic relationships, had turned our marriage into a secret research project. Every recent conversation about growth and change took on new meaning. She hadn't been sharing her thoughts with me, she'd been testing theories, gathering data, crafting narratives. My phone buzzed. Emma, confirming dinner plans. The casual domesticity of the message felt surreal against the weight of what lay spread across our coffee table. I should have told you sooner, Lisa whispered, gathering the materials back into the folder. But Emma, she's so convinced she's on some grand journey of authenticity. She talks about it like she's having a spiritual awakening. After Lisa left, I stood in our kitchen, staring at the coffee maker Emma had bought last Christmas, a sophisticated machine that could be programmed to have her perfect cup ready each morning. Now I wondered if even this simple gesture of care had been noted in her observations, analyzed as an example of how routine could masquerade as romance. The house felt different now, every object transformed into potential material for her research. The photos on our walls, the shared calendar on our fridge, the silly magnets we'd collected from our travels, all of it could be fodder for her theories about the evolution of love and the constraints of commitment. I picked up my phone, staring at her dinner invitation. The cursor blinked in the reply field, waiting for an answer. What do you say to someone who's turned your love story into a scholarly dissection of relationship limitations? Finally I typed. Looking forward to it. Because sometimes I realized the greatest betrayals aren't the ones that happen in hidden moments or secret meetings. Sometimes they happen right in front of us, in the quiet spaces between who we think we are to someone and who we've become in their narrative. The restaurant Emma chose for dinner was new, modern, all clean lines and minimalist decor, as if someone had decided to strip away everything unnecessary until only essence remained. Like her recent approach to our marriage, I thought, watching her study the menu with academic intensity. She wore her hair pulled back severely, silver earrings I'd never seen before catching the light. The woman across from me looked more like a visiting professor than the Emma who used to steal my dessert and laugh until wine came out of her nose. I've been doing a lot of thinking, she said, carefully arranging her napkin across her lap. About us, about growth, about the nature of love itself. Her tone carried that familiar therapeutic cadence, and I wondered if she was mentally taking notes for her book. I thought about the folder Lisa had shown me, about Emma's careful documentation of our relationship's supposed limitations. Every gesture between us now felt performative, as if we were actors in her grand thesis about the evolution of love. Tell me about your therapy group, I said, surprising both of us. Her hand paused halfway to her water glass, a micro-expression of alarm crossing her face before her professional mask slipped back into place. It's transformative, she said carefully, selecting her words like ingredients for a precise recipe. We're exploring new paradigms of connection, challenging traditional narratives about commitment and growth. I watched her speak, remembering the photo of her at the podium, wondering how many times she'd rehearsed these very words. And what about our narrative, Emma? Where does that fit in your research? The word research landed like a stone in still water. Her eyes widened slightly, the first genuine reaction I'd seen from her all evening. How did you? Does it matter? I interrupted softly. Isn't transparency part of your new paradigm? The waiter appeared, his timing impeccable in its awkwardness. Emma ordered a complex dish I'd never heard of, while I chose soup, my stomach too knotted for anything more substantial. When we were alone again, she leaned forward, her voice taking on that earnest quality she used with particularly resistant clients. Nathan, you have to understand. What I'm doing, it's important. I'm documenting a journey that could help countless couples understand the natural evolution of our evolution? I cut in. Or your evolution, Emma? Because from where I'm sitting, this feels less like growth and more like excavation. You're digging up our foundations to study them, without checking if the house might collapse. She sat back, something flashing in her eyes, frustration? Guilt? Or just annoyance at her research subject going off script. That's exactly the kind of conventional thinking that limits us, she said. This rigid adherence to traditional structures, this fear of examining the very nature of our bonds. I found your journal, I said quietly. The words stopped her mid-theory, her fork clattering slightly against her plate. The one where you write about me representing limitation. About devotion being another word for constraint. For a moment, her professional veneer cracked. I caught a glimpse of something raw underneath, not guilt exactly, but perhaps recognition. Recognition that she'd been caught performing surgery on our marriage while pretending to merely observe it. Nathan, she started then stopped. For the first time in months, she seemed genuinely unsure of her script. It's not what you think. The book, the research, it's about understanding how relationships evolve. How people can grow together or grow apart, I finished. But did you ever consider, Emma, that by turning our marriage into your case study, you made that outcome inevitable? When did I stop being your husband and become your thesis subject? The silence between us expanded like a living thing. Around us, other diners continued their normal evening, unaware that at our table, years of shared history were being rewritten into academic footnotes. Emma's phone buzzed, probably another message from her therapy group, another piece of data for her grand theory about the limitations of traditional love. She didn't check it though. Instead, she stared at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between regret and revelation. I never meant to, she began, but I cut her off gently. I know, I said, and I did know. That was perhaps the most painful part. She hadn't set out to betray our marriage, she'd simply decided to study it to death. After the restaurant confrontation, I expected Emma to retreat into her clinical shell. Instead, she did something that shook the foundations of everything I thought I knew about our situation. She laughed, a sharp, almost manic sound that made other diners turn their heads. Oh, Nathan, she said, wiping tears from her eyes. You think you've figured it all out, don't you? The book, the research, the workshops, you think that's the whole story? She reached into her bag and pulled out a sleek leather notebook I'd never seen before. You want to know what I'm really writing about? She slid the notebook across the table. Inside, in her precise handwriting, was a detailed account of our marriage, but not as a clinical case study. Instead, it was a love story, raw and honest, documenting her desperate attempts to save us from what she saw as an inevitable end. I've been studying failing marriages for years, Nathan, she said, her voice trembling. I see the patterns, the slow decay, the quiet deaths. I started the research because I was terrified we were heading down the same path. The workshops, the therapy groups. I was looking for answers, trying to find a way to evolve before we became another statistic. My head spun as she continued. But something happened during my research. I discovered that most couples don't actually grow apart. They actively push each other away out of fear. Fear of vulnerability, fear of dependency, fear of loss. And I realized. Her voice caught. I realized I was doing exactly that. The waiter appeared with our food, but neither of us moved to eat. Emma's hands shook as she pulled out another notebook, the one I'd found in her office. You read about limitation and constraint, but did you read the next page? She flipped it open, revealing passages I hadn't seen. Every time I tried to create distance, to analyze our relationship clinically, N finds ways to remind me why I fell in love with him. His quiet strength, his unwavering patience, the way he still looks at me like I'm the answer to a question he never knew he had. Am I pushing him away because I'm evolving, or because I'm terrified of how much I still need him? The book isn't about the death of traditional marriage, Nathan, she said softly. It's about fear, how we sabotage our deepest connections because we're afraid of how much power they have over us. I've been documenting my own self-sabotage, watching myself try to destroy the very thing I'm most afraid of losing. My soup grew cold as I tried to process this revelation. But the therapy group, the workshops, are real, she finished. But not in the way you think. I've been leading sessions about recognition and intervention, helping couples identify when they're actively working to destroy their own happiness. Using myself as the primary case study. She pulled out her phone, showing me the complete message thread I'd only glimpsed parts of, arrangements for publishing a book titled Saving Us from Ourselves, A therapist's journey through self-sabotage. The irony hit me like a physical force. While I'd been gathering evidence of her emotional retreat, she'd been documenting her desperate attempt to understand and prevent it. We'd been conducting parallel investigations, each of us trying to save our marriage in entirely different ways. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Because I'm a coward," she replied, tears now flowing freely. "Because it was easier to pretend I was conducting academic research than to admit I was terrified of how much I love you, of how completely my happiness depends on us. I thought if I could understand it clinically, I could control it. Instead, I nearly destroyed everything I was trying to save." Around us, the restaurant continued its evening symphony of clinking glasses and murmured conversations, but at our table, time seemed suspended. I stared at my wife, this brilliant, complicated woman who had tied herself in knots trying to protect herself from the very love she was afraid of losing. The real question now wasn't whether our marriage would survive, but whether we could find our way back to each other through this maze of fear and self-protection we both helped create. The drive home from the restaurant felt surreal, each streetlight casting alternating patterns of light and shadow across Emma's face as she sat silent beside me. Her notebooks lay between us on the console, physical manifestations of the gap we'd created in our marriage, each trying to save it in our own misguided way. The house felt different when we entered, as if the weight of revelations had altered its very atmosphere. Emma moved through our living room like a ghost, trailing her fingers along the spines of books we'd collected together, pausing at photos that marked our shared history. "I found something else," she said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. She disappeared into her office, returning with a worn leather journal I recognized from our early years together. "I've been reading our old letters, trying to understand when I started being afraid of us." She opened the journal to a dog-eared page, her hands trembling slightly. "Remember when you were stuck in Chicago during that snowstorm? You wrote this to me." She began reading. "I miss the way you steal the covers, the little humming sound you make when you're reading something interesting, even the way you always forget to close cabinet doors. I miss the imperfect pieces of you that make us perfect together." The words hung in the air between us, echoes of a simpler time when love wasn't something to be analyzed or feared. Emma's voice cracked as she continued. "I've spent years helping couples navigate their fears, but I couldn't see how my own fear was poisoning us. I was so focused on preventing our death that I stopped nurturing our life." I watched her sink onto our couch, the journal cradled in her lap like something precious and fragile. The evening light painted shadows across her face, highlighting the vulnerability I hadn't seen in months. "You know what scares me most?" she said, looking up at me with eyes that reminded me of our first date, wide, honest, unguarded. "Not that you'll leave after learning about all this, but that you'll stay without ever trusting me again. That we'll become one of those couples who survive but never really heal." I sat beside her, careful to maintain a small distance. "Why the therapy group? The workshops? All that talk about evolving beyond traditional marriage?" She laughed softly, but the sound held no joy. "Because I thought if I could intellectualize love, I could control it. If I could turn our relationship into data points and case studies, maybe it wouldn't hurt so much when—" She stopped, swallowing hard. "When what?" "When you realized I wasn't enough." The words came out in a rush. "When you saw through all my professional success and psychological insights to the scared girl who still doesn't believe she deserves this kind of love." The revelation hit me like a physical force. All this time, I'd been gathering evidence of her emotional retreat, while she'd been documenting her desperate attempt to become someone worthy of staying for. "But there's something else," she said, reaching for her phone with shaking hands. "Something I haven't told you about the workshops, about what's really been happening in those therapy sessions." The look in her eyes made my blood run cold, a mixture of fear and resignation that suggested whatever came next would change everything. Again. Emma's hands trembled as she pulled up a series of messages on her phone. The blue light cast an eerie glow across her face, highlighting the tears gathering in her eyes. "I've been lying," she whispered. "But not in the way you think. The therapy group wasn't just about research or self-discovery. It had become something else entirely, a safe haven for her growing relationship with someone who attended her workshops. Dr. James Morrison, a visiting professor of psychology who specialized in relationship dynamics. It started innocently, she said, her voice barely audible. Theoretical discussions after workshops, shared insights about marriage evolution. But somewhere along the way, she stopped, struggling with words that seemed to physically pain her. We crossed lines we shouldn't have. Emotional lines at first, then. The room seemed to tilt sideways as the truth emerged. Their connection had grown during late-night discussions about relationship theory, evolving into something more intimate during conferences and workshop retreats. What began as intellectual attraction had transformed into something that threatened to destroy everything we'd built. The book, the research about self-sabotage, it was all true, she continued, tears now flowing freely. But I was also documenting my own descent into exactly what I claimed to be studying. I became the perfect case study of someone destroying their marriage out of fear and self-doubt. I stood up, needing physical distance from the confession unfolding before me. Photos of our life together stared down from the walls, moments frozen in time when trust wasn't something we had to question. How long? 3 months, she whispered. But it's over. I ended it last week, before the dinner at Le Jardin Secret. That's why I wanted to meet there, neutral ground to tell you everything. But when you confronted me about the research, I lost my nerve. The cruel irony wasn't lost on me. While I'd been investigating her suspicious behavior, finding evidence of her research and workshops, I'd completely missed the actual betrayal happening beneath the academic facade. All this time, I said, my voice sounding strange to my own ears, you were writing about fear of intimacy, about couples pushing each other away, while actively participating in the very destruction you claimed to be studying? She flinched at the words. I know how it sounds. The therapist who couldn't therapy her way out of her own dysfunction. I convinced myself I was doing research, gathering data about how marriages fall apart. But really, I was just documenting my own unraveling. The notebooks on the coffee table seemed to mock us now, filled with her observations about fear and self-sabotage, all while she was living out the very pattern she claimed to be studying. The ultimate case study in betrayal, written in her precise therapeutic handwriting. James wasn't the cause, she added softly. He was just the symptom. I was so afraid of losing you, of not being enough, that I created a self-fulfilling prophecy. I turned our marriage into an academic study because it was easier than facing my own fears about intimacy and worthiness. I thought about all the signs I'd misinterpreted. Her late nights weren't just spent writing or attending workshops. Her distance wasn't solely about professional growth. The truth had been hidden in plain sight, wrapped in layers of psychological theory and academic research. What happens now? I asked, more to the room than to her. The question seemed to echo off the walls of our home, bouncing back to us like a challenge neither of us was prepared to answer. Emma stood, wrapping her arms around herself like armor. I don't know, she admitted. I've spent so much time analyzing relationships, writing about how couples recover from betrayal, and now. She gestured helplessly at the space between us. Now I'm on the other side of all those theories, and none of them tell me how to fix what I've broken. I spent that night in a hotel, surrounded by the antiseptic cleanliness of starched sheets and anonymous furniture. The room's bland artwork and generic decor felt appropriate. I was a man temporarily stripped of identity, floating in the space between who I'd been yesterday and who I'd have to become tomorrow. Sleep proved elusive. Instead, I found myself obsessively scrolling through photos on my phone, watching our shared history transform before my eyes. Each image now held double meaning. Emma at her psychology conference in Seattle. Had he been there? Her proud smile at the launch of her therapy practice. Had they already begun their theoretical discussions? Every memory felt tainted, corrupted by the shadow of betrayal. Around 3 a.m, my phone buzzed with a text from Emma. I know you need space. But please read this when you can. Attached was a document titled, The Truth About Lies. Against my better judgment, I opened it. Nathan. I've spent years helping couples navigate the aftermath of betrayal, using clinical terms like infidelity-induced trauma and attachment injury. Now I find myself on the other side of those sterile phrases, drowning in the mess I've created. The cruel irony isn't lost on me, how I turned our marriage into a case study of relationship dysfunction while actively participating in its destruction. Dr. Morrison wasn't just an affair partner. He was a mirror reflecting back all my theories about love and fear, validating my academic distance from our marriage. I chose him because he made my betrayal feel scholarly, intellectual, anything but what it really was, a desperate attempt to prove I didn't need you as much as I do. The workshop group knows nothing about us. I've been leading sessions on relationship recovery while secretly unraveling our own. Every theory I presented, every insight I claimed to discover, they were all desperate attempts to understand my own actions, to find some psychological framework that would make my choices feel less devastating. I don't expect forgiveness. I'm not even sure I deserve understanding. But you should know that while I was documenting patterns of self-sabotage in relationships, I was really writing a confession. Every page of research was a letter to you I was too cowardly to send. Asterisk. I closed the document, watching the city lights flicker through the hotel window. The truth about Emma's betrayal felt both worse and somehow more human than I'd imagined. She hadn't just had an affair, she'd turned it into an academic study, as if examining it through a clinical lens could somehow diminish its reality. My phone buzzed again. I've withdrawn from the keynote speech. Cancelled the book deal. Some truths shouldn't be packaged as research. Dawn found me standing at the window, watching early morning joggers navigate empty streets. I thought about Emma's words, about fear of needing someone too much, about turning betrayal into theory to avoid feeling its weight. About how sometimes we destroy the very things we're most afraid of losing. The irony was suffocating. While I'd been investigating her suspicious behavior, gathering evidence of her research and workshops, I'd completely missed the human story underneath. Emma hadn't just been studying the death of marriages, she'd been documenting her own emotional unraveling, turning our relationship into a case study because it was easier than facing the raw truth of her actions. In the sterile quiet of the hotel room, I realized something that felt both profound and devastating. Sometimes understanding why someone hurt you only makes the pain more complex. A month passed. Seasons shifted, leaves turned golden, and I found myself sitting in Emma's therapy office after hours, surrounded by the carefully curated environment where she'd helped so many couples navigate their own storms. The irony wasn't lost on me. She sat in her client chair, leaving her therapist's seat empty, a small gesture that spoke volumes about where we now stood. The late afternoon light filtered through Venetian blinds, painting stripes across the carpet between us like the bars of a cage we'd built together. I found your final research notes, I said, placing a leather-bound journal on the coffee table between us. The ones you wrote after everything came out. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for it. I couldn't stop documenting, she whispered. Even after the betrayal, the clinical observer in me kept taking notes. As if somehow, if I could understand it perfectly, I could undo it. I watched her finger trace the edges of the journal, remembering how those same hands used to trace patterns on my skin in the early morning light. Your last entry was interesting, I said. About how betrayal isn't just about the act itself, but about the stories we tell ourselves to justify it. She looked up, tears gathering but not falling. I spent years helping couples understand that healing isn't about forgetting, but about finding a new way to remember. Now I'm not sure I understand anything at all. The silence between us felt different now, no longer charged with unspoken accusations, but heavy with the weight of possibilities, both terrible and beautiful. I've been thinking about what you wrote, I continued. About fear being the real betrayal. How you were so afraid of needing me that you created a scenario where you couldn't have me at all. Classic self-fulfilling prophecy, she said with a bitter laugh. I could write a textbook about it. Oh wait, I almost did. The thing is, Emma. I leaned forward, studying the way shadows played across her face. I've been writing too. Not research, not case studies. Just truth. I pulled out my own notebook, a simple composition book filled with my scattered thoughts from the past month. I realized something. While you were documenting the death of our marriage, I was guilty of my own form of emotional distance. I saw the signs, felt the changes, but I chose to play detective instead of husband. I turned your betrayal into a mystery to solve rather than a crisis to face. Her breath caught audibly. Nathan, we're both guilty of academic distance, I continued. You with your research, me with my investigation. We both chose observation over participation. The only difference is the way we destroyed things. The truth of it hung between us like smoke, how we'd both contributed to this elaborate dance of avoidance, each in our own way choosing documentation over connection. So where does that leave us? She asked, voice barely above a whisper. I stood, moving to the window to watch the city lights flicker to life in the gathering dusk. I don't know, I admitted. But I do know this, sometimes understanding why something broke doesn't fix it. Sometimes it just helps you build something new from the pieces. I turned back to face her, seeing not the polished therapist or the guilty wife, but simply Emma, complicated, flawed, human Emma. I can't promise forgiveness yet, I said softly. But I can promise presence. Real presence, not clinical observation. If you're willing to do the same. She stood slowly, leaving both our journals on the coffee table, physical remnants of our separate attempts to make sense of love's complexity. No more research, she said. No more case studies. Just us trying to find our way back to truth. As we stood there in the deepening twilight, I realized something profound. Sometimes the greatest act of love isn't in never falling apart, but in choosing to rebuild from the rubble. Not because of clinical theories or relationship studies, but because of the simple, terrifying truth that some connections are worth the risk of being real. The city hummed beyond the windows, a reminder that life continues even when we think it's stopped. Emma moved closer, not touching, but present in a way she hadn't been in months. And in that moment, I understood that this raw, honest, terrifying presence, was perhaps the only real starting point for whatever came next.